introduction before. I've given many talks, but I've never given one with this background. It's the most fantastic place to be. So welcome. Really happy to be here. So what I wanted to talk to you today was about AI, and more specifically, what's been the buzz all along since, the last 8 to 12 months is generative AI, and what companies like Verizon are doing along with others in this space. So let me start, make sure I get this right. So I'm the Chief Product Officer at Verizon Business. What that means is that I own the product strategy for all our B2B segments. What I am also part of is our AI Leadership Council. And I'll talk to you a little more about that. But what that is a cross-functional team of people from the business like myself, but also our legal teams, our CIO, our Chief Information Security Officer, our technology organizations, our AI teams, but really a cross-functional team that is helping set our policies around AI. And I'll come back to that and why that is so important in what we decide to do as we move forward. But let me start with the reason we're all here today is you've all heard of ChatGPT. Now, ChatGPT is the most viral technology that has happened. It reached 1 million users in 5 days and 100 million users in less than 2 months. Unbelievable. So if you look at some of these other apps, whether it's Instagram, Snapchat, ChatGPT put them all to shame. Now let me ask all of you a question. How many of you were surprised or were not familiar with ChatGPT and OpenAI when you first heard about it? Yeah. How many of you were surprised at how popular it got? Many more, right? So that's the thing. So for people who've been in the AI field, they have been familiar with what OpenAI was doing. They were familiar with GPT as the large language model. They were even familiar with ChatGPT. But what took everybody by surprise was the fact that the adoption of ChatGPT far surpassed even what the founders of the company, what the developers of ChatGPT had expected. It caught like wildfire. My son, in fact, he uses it as a verb now. I ChatGPT'd that essay, or we ChatGPT'd something. So, you know, something has really gained adoption if it becomes a verb. But one of the things to remember is that AI is not necessarily new. A lot of people think this is, that ChatGPT is the start of AI, but it's not really. One thing before I move to that is, as we talk about ChatGPT, what you see is just the tip of the iceberg. Below the surface is a massive large language model that is processing and cycling tons and tons of data so that when you ask ChatGPT a question about Christopher Columbus, or you ask GPT a question about history, you ask ChatGPT a question about the capitals of different countries in the world, it's that large language model sitting underneath that has processed everything from the web, books, papers, and is able to generate that output. So sitting below the application that you use for generative AI is the large language model. And we'll talk about that a little bit. So I was starting to say that AI is not new. In fact, it's been around since the 1950s, actually, and it's had its ups and downs. And it's only been in the last, maybe decade or so that AI has crept into our lives. And it's done that because we started having massive amounts of data along with the ability to compute that has led to machine learning, led to deep learning. Machine learning is what many of us deal with on a regular basis that we may or may not even be aware. Machine learning has to do with AI finding patterns in massive amounts of data. So think about dynamic pricing engines. Think about targeted advertising. Think about algorithmic trading. All of that happens through machine learning. Healthcare diagnosis. Every time you have an AI-assisted decision, that's usually machine learning. And so as the engine crawls through tremendous amounts of data, it uses it to identify, classify, do object recognition. And its goal is decision making. It's to help make a decision. Deep learning is another area of AI, but that's mainly focused on unstructured data like images. If you look at your Google pictures and it being able to associate faces, all of that is unstructured data. That's been around for a while. Companies like Verizon have been doing a lot of work in machine learning, deep learning. If you think about how we build our infrastructure, think about fraud, whether it's your credit card companies and they're trying to identify fraud, Verizon trying to identify fraud, deciding where to place our network elements, how to ensure that we can predict failures before they happen. All of that is machine learning and deep learning. Generative is different because it is now doing what machine learning and deep learning did, which is analyzing a lot of data, but what it's also doing is creating content that didn't exist before. So we still hear people sometimes mix traditional with generative, but the true sense of generative is that it's creating content that did not exist before. And that could be text, which is the most advanced, but it can also be images. It can be software. It can be audio. It can be anything. But it creates that based on the large language model that it sits on top of, and it is doing a statistical processing of words and phrases to make sure that they make sense together. So once again, a lot of people think ChatGPT is a subject matter expert. It's obviously not. It's based on the training model that is used to ensure that the most highly statistical combination of words and phrases that make sense. And many of these models also we do that in Verizon, is what's called it's learning from human feedback. Reinforcement learning from human feedback is that a lot of humans are actually involved in the training process to validate. So generative AI is new, and I'll talk about what Verizon is doing in that space. Now, I'm sure you can't read this, but I wanted to talk a little bit about what some of the risks are and what are we doing to mitigate. Now, I mentioned that I was part of an AI leadership council, and the reason for the council is to make sure that we use generative AI in a thoughtful and pragmatic way. Normally what you see is some people who are very much focused on the opportunity associated with Gen AI, which is great, and then you have the other side of people who think it's the worst thing ever. It's going to take all our jobs away, there'll be nothing for us to do, and we should ban it, right? The reality is most things are somewhere in the middle. So if you think about what some of the risks of Gen AI are, is sometimes it hallucinates. It might give you incorrect information. Most of the time, it works pretty well, which is why you've seen such large adoption, which is 100 million users in less than 2 months. But there are times when it would sound confident but give you incorrect information. And because there's no citations, there's no explainability, that can be a challenge. So accuracy is sometimes a question mark. There could be copyright infringement. ChatGPT takes a lot of data, takes code from GitHub and other places. Are we really attributing and making sure that the IP associated with the source content is given credit? There's bias. There's bias in the data that all these large language models use. So is it going to continue to perpetuate the bias that is in the data? You've heard about deep fakes. While AI can help with security, it can also create sophisticated fraud situations, which might be difficult, much harder to to capture. All of these can be mitigated. So it's not that there aren't ways to do it, but the reason in your companies or where you come from, it's important to have a cross-sectional team is to ensure that you are looking at other sides of it. In companies like Verizon, we have a lot of proprietary data, but more importantly, we have a lot of customer data. And what we don't want is inadvertently, unintentionally, for Verizon to let the data from our customers leak in a way that we do not want to have happen. So the reason for having a thoughtful and pragmatic approach is to make sure that some of the risks that we have with Gen AI, we have the right countermeasures to be able to protect ourselves against it. So when you think about generative AI, I really think about it in 4 layers. And let me start from the bottom. One is, it's the application. That's what most of us are familiar with. ChatGPT is an example of an end-user application of generative AI. So is GitHub Copilot, which is used by software developers as they write code. So that's the end use. There's a number of companies that are focused on just the end-user application. That's an area that's ripe for startups. Then the generative AI models, the LLMs, you have obviously OpenAI, which is now funded by, heavily funded by Microsoft as well. You have Google, you have NVIDIA, you have Amazon, AWS. So they're all building large language models, which is what you saw below the surface of the iceberg, which is where they collect a lot of information and they're training the models to be able to generate the right output. And companies like Verizon use more than one LLM. So you don't have to stick to one. The third is network infrastructure. Now think about all this data. This data has to be transported securely, reliably from point A to point B. So if you're interested in generative AI, your organizations, your companies, you would have to make sure your data is carefully and securely transported from where it's generated to where it's going to be processed as part of the large language model. And then finally, storage and compute. This is where the GPUs come in. This is where the massive supercomputing clusters are built, whether it's in Microsoft's data centers, whether it's in Amazon's data centers. This is where they actually analyze and process massive amounts of data. So to give us the ability to ask any question and make generative AI like ChatGPT a general purpose application. So I want to talk about use cases, and this is where it gets interesting. So, all right, so now you've understood what the building blocks are. So what do you do with them? So the areas that are the most mature right now are marketing, software development, right? So if you think about, or even writing sales emails, we do that within Verizon, or marketing campaigns where you can get generative AI to create the first draft of what you want to send out. Now, once again, because we don't have confidence in the accuracy of what it does, there's always a human involved in the loop. We haven't taken humans out, and it'll be a while before these models or the users of these models are confident enough to do that. So if you think about marketing campaigns, and this is where traditional and generative AI come together, a traditional machine learning marketing campaign will target the right customers for your products and services. But generative AI will create the content that's personalized for the user you're targeting. So today's marketing methods are targeting you based on your buying patterns, but they still make mistakes. Sometimes I get a lot of emails and mail with the wrong gender, right? I think happens to many of us. But the next step is to actually understand that better and create personalized content that did not exist before. That's what generative AI would do. So you will see and the other thing with marketing is creating new designs, new images. You can cycle through them very quickly. So it's a great a great tool. Generative AI is a great tool on the marketing front. Software development we talked about, where Verizon and many other companies are using generative AI to create new code for them. Once again, we still want to make sure that you have a human, somebody with subject matter expertise to take a look at it. But the productivity improvements are tremendous if you can have a generative AI engine create the first draft of code for you. The other area that there's a lot of interest is a chat GPT-like function, but for business. Think about your own businesses, where you work. You have a lot of proprietary data, but can you ask any question that you want? Like, where is this product? Did somebody else buy it? When was the last time it was used? What were the issues with it? Were there any problems? Did customers like it? There's a lot of information that sometimes people have locked in their heads, or in companies, it's locked in different silos. That kind of knowledge expert, a Q&A, assistant, co-pilot, is a tremendous benefit where you won't have to go around searching for information. You just ask a question in conversational English that says, has this been done before? Has my company done this? Who's bought this? That type of information is very valuable, and Verizon, we are experimenting with that. But it comes back to what I spoke about before. You have to be careful about data leakage. If I'm asking my co-pilot questions about a service that Verizon has, and it touches a customer, and there's customer data in it, we have to be absolutely sure that that data doesn't leak out. So that's why, as all of you experiment with generative AI, the one thing I do want to stress is you have to have enterprise protections. You have to work with the right partners who will give you confidence in your data. And then the area that we've seen a lot of advances in that is quite interesting is what we call customer service. Customer service can be in various forms. It could be calling into an 800 number. It could be using chatbots to interact with a product that you just bought. Now, so far, most of these chatbots are rules-based. Did I pay my bill? When is my shipment going to arrive? Where's my, what's the tracking number? When is it, it's very transactional. We don't have many chatbots that are actually conversational, where you say, okay, I may have paid my bill, but is this the right product? What should I be looking at? Can you give me any suggestions? So really a more intelligent virtual assistant. That's one of the areas where generative AI is going to make a huge difference, because it can look up your account and it can tell you, okay, you've bought this before. Like if you go to Nordstrom and you're buying something, it can look up your account and know what you've bought. But then you can ask it, has something new come up? Should I be buying these? Should I, so imagine having that kind of dialogue in conversational natural language in 140 different languages, doesn't have to be English, with a virtual assistant. So that should be exciting, and we'll start seeing more and more of that, not just from Verizon, but also from all these other organizations and companies that you work with. The second area is also part of what we call contact center, but that is where you're actually speaking to a live agent, because these are the more complex issues. Like let's say you had a problem with a product or service, or you have questions, you've called somebody, and you're actually speaking to a live person. Now, I'm sure many of us, especially if the product portfolio is complex, we sometimes get frustrated with the person at the other end of the line who don't have all the information, or they're telling us something and it's taking much longer, and they put you on hold and they go back and they find it. Imagine a Gen AI engine that is listening to you and what you're asking, with your consent, of course, so it will always be opt-in, but is listening to the audio of your conversation and making suggestions to the agent. Based on this, I think you should suggest that. This is what they're asking for. This is the area that they need help with. They called about this 2 weeks ago. Don't give them the same answer that you gave them 2 weeks ago. So it can really enhance the productivity, the efficiency of an agent, even if it's a live agent. So that's another area that we expect to see a lot of improvements as we move forward with generative AI. And then these are just the areas that we know about. One of the exciting things about new technologies is that you always start with taking an existing process or technology and put it on steroids. So everything I've discussed so far is about improvement of something that already existed. What is really exciting, and that is, I think, that we are just starting to figure out is, what can this do that didn't exist today? And that's where the innovation comes in. That's where the innovation of events like this, where it can be products and services that did not exist before today. And the only reason it can exist now is because of technologies like generative AI, where once again, it's creating content. The one thing people sometimes tell me is, because it's not 100% accurate, we shouldn't use it. And my response to it is, this is not a calculator. A calculator gives you black and white answers, right? So it's right or it's wrong. Think of this as a reasoning agent. It obviously gave you that answer based on its training model. And you can go back and forth with it. How did it come up with that answer? Why did you choose this? Why did you give me this? So think about how you can use this as a reasoning agent to figure out and maybe learn something more ourselves. I've been using some productivity tools, and sometimes it doesn't give me the answer I expected. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, because like a co-pilot, like somebody else, it makes me think about, okay, maybe I need to view this differently. So that's the interesting thing about having AI be a reasoning agent, not necessarily a mathematical agent with a right or wrong answer, but something that you can go back and forth with and figure it out. And the final thing I'll say before I wrap is what's making our lives a lot easier is that, as you think, many of you spend a lot of time in meetings, especially after COVID. It seems like our meetings have exploded. And people sometimes, if you can't attend the meeting, they'll send you a replay. I don't know how many of you have watched replays, but nobody has time to watch a full replay. But you can use generative AI to ask questions about it. Was there any decisions made? Did we talk about pricing? Was there any discussion? Was there any dissent? Who spoke the most? What were their viewpoints? You can query a meeting, and you'll start seeing responses to that. Microsoft does that today. So that's the interesting thing is, you can now get a lot more information and use your time much more wisely than we could before, because now if you want to get the essence of a meeting that you missed, you don't have to watch the whole replay. You can get it from a Gen AI engine that is going to answer your question. It's like somebody who was passively listening and can now answer your questions for you. So with that, I'm going to wrap. Thank you for your time. It's been great to be here, and hopefully all of you will get to use generative AI some more, and I hope you found this time useful, and looking forward to seeing the innovations that I talked about that come into position here. So thank you again for your time.